Okay, we are officially recording, so we'll jump right back where we were. We are thinking about teaching the whole person, 3 areas of the person that reflect a holistic understanding of how people learn. We learn knowledge with our intellect. We have attitudes and values through which we learn, our will and our emotions. And then we have these physical skills and habits that we express through the body, this physical act of learning. These areas are typically called domains, the domains of learning. So knowledge, the domain of teaching we know most about because we often teach only toward the mind. We want people to just digest this content and spit it back sometimes. It's based on information. It doesn't do anything else other than basically rote memorization. Or how about the domain of teaching that is directed toward attitudes, values, or commitments? This helps complete a holistic model of teaching. This is a very important part of teaching because not only do we want people to understand a concept or an idea, but we want them to value it. We want them to have a commitment to it or some sense of passion or enthusiasm about it. And how much more so if we're doing the work of the church, if we're doing the work of faith, for this teaching aspect to be an important integral part of shaping the whole person. When we begin to think about our objectives for a learning situation, we must always think about how a person feels about a topic. So we're inviting them to be emotively responsive. And then also physical skills or habits. We're teaching people to do something, right? So we teach people that will then act on what they have learned. They will have a new skill, or they will go from the teaching moment to living out principles. Maybe they'll even go from learning to teaching themselves. So we want to teach the whole person, not one simple aspect of the person, but the entire person. And so we're thinking about these 3 domains: knowledge, attitudes, and commitment, and then these physical skills or habits. And every good teacher thinks about all 3 of these domains of learning when she's preparing a lesson. You might think about the last time you taught. Were there some in the class who simply didn't want to learn, didn't want necessarily to be taught? And if so, how did they reflect that, lack of responsiveness to the teaching moment? How would you describe that?
Well, a lot of times you can see it in, their body language,
Right.
whether they're responding to what you're saying or not.
So true. Yeah. And when we come at the teaching moment, we have a particular something that we want the students to go away with, that we have these objectives at heart for being engaged mentally, emotionally, and physically to then respond on it. But it takes a participation. It definitely takes an investment on the part of the teacher and on part of the student. So as we reflect on these 3 areas, knowledge, attitude, and physical skill, let's think about, I want to use resource 6.1, page 39. And I want to think about this. If our group was writing together 3 goals that reflect the areas of knowledge, attitude, physical skill with a particular topic, if our particular topic is, and I just kind of came up with this, I thought it might be appropriate for us to think about, if our lesson topic is becoming a welcoming group, or becoming an open group, becoming a welcoming group. You may want to write this in on your, if you've got resource 6.1 open, fill that in the lesson topic, because I want us to jot down some ideas together. Becoming a welcoming and open group. And if the age group is 12 to 15-year-olds, 12 to 15-year-olds, so they're not, of course, nursery, they're not primary or elementary, they're beyond that, they're moving into adolescence. And I think everybody in our group together here has worked with youth in some capacity. So this would be a good thing for us to reflect on together. So this is what I invite us to think about, to write goals that reflect each area in these domains of teaching: knowledge, attitude, and physical skill. What are some goals that perhaps are information or content driven that we want the students in this age group to come away with if we're talking about becoming a welcoming or an open group, a welcoming open group?
Well, one goal for knowledge would be able to define what a welcoming group is.
Yeah, yeah, have a real clear definition of what that means. What might be a good way of doing that, since we're doing this in the context of church? What might be a good way, starting point for identifying? Well, I'll just say it, a textbook, right? Which our text is scripture. I would say a good place to start is to have a biblical passage that you might want to focus on. We might memorize a scripture passage. We might explore a passage in which we see the church opening themselves to society, to the world around them in ways that expresses the Christ-likeness that they are characterized by. That the Holy Spirit moves them to act like Jesus in the world around them. And so we might use scripture. We might have them memorize a passage, right? What are some ways that you would want to, what are some information, content-driven goals that you might have for this group of 12 to 15-year-olds? While you're thinking about that, okay, what are some goals that we need to name these so that we can move on? Just name them. If it's memorizing a scripture passage, learning a Bible story, particular Bible story, but the idea is there's certain information and content that we want the students to know. We want them to digest with their mind and to know. So moving on to attitude or commitment. What are goals we might have for the students if our lesson topic for the day, and we've got, 7 or 8, 12 to 15-year-olds, and we're teaching them to become a welcoming and open group? What are some goals that we might have that would foster an attitude in which they're committed to that kind of idea?
Talk to at least one person that they don't normally talk to. Excellent.
Yeah. And that might even be a physical skill. I think that goal would fall under physical skill, that they employ a particular practice in order to move past maybe being kind of closed and reserved, or even cliquish, or just us. We're happy with it being just us. Someone new comes and they have a hard time breaking in because we're happy being us, but that's an excellent one. A goal of each one, break out and talk to somebody new. What's another goal? And it could be physical skill, attitude, or knowledge.
I'd say just kind of be attentive. I mean, pay attention to other people. If they're just kind of paying attention to their body language.
Okay, like during the classroom setting, or I say classroom, Bible study setting, or Wednesday night, or whenever the group meets. Let's see, another one for commitment or attitudes or values. A commitment to celebrating the fact that we're all very different in our group, celebrating the fact that we're in different grades, perhaps, in the 12 to 15-year-olds, celebrating and appreciating different ages within the group, what they offer, these hierarchy systems oftentimes, and particularly adolescent groups, and perhaps recognizing and valuing the different ages and what they bring. Maybe a level of energy in a young group, maybe a level of thoughtfulness, being able to speak and articulate for some of the older ones, or maybe just even bringing some humor to the class or the meeting. So I would invite you to be thinking about that. Come back to that resource 6.1. Maybe perhaps by the time we've moved through this a little bit, your creative juices will be flowing a little more to think through some of this. So as we think about these three models of learning, go ahead and pull out resource 6.2. It's on page 40. You can have that available. You may want to take notes on this, write down examples and things as we explore ideas about these three different models of learning that we're going to look at. Information processing. This is of course mine. These three, we're going to look at them closer. Involves the communication of information from the teacher. Also gives students tools to find information for themselves. I don't mean gives them Google or gives them Wikipedia, but gives them tools, meaning encourages and invites them to begin asking the kind of questions so that they then explore ideas, that they then move from what is unknown to what is known, that they can kind of begin the education process themselves and continue it. The goal is that eventually students will be able to think for themselves. We're not seeking to create mindless disciples. We're seeking to develop, cultivate, to foster thought Christ-like followers. So while we are teaching facts, we are also teaching methods of discovery. We want them to think. I had a professor in college who on his door had a poster of a painting of Jesus, and it said, Jesus came to save us from our sins, not our minds. And the idea, of course, is yes, he does save us from thoughts, or we do hold every thought captive to Christ. But at the same time, he's saying on this poster, he didn't come to save us, to deliver us from being thinking individuals. We are to be thoughtful, mindful creatures. So that we don't just tell people what the Bible says. We teach people the tools to study the Bible for themselves, to ask questions about it, to teach them to say, what is the primary idea in this passage? And to be equipped to think about the historical context of a scripture biblical passage and to come to terms with what this passage is trying to say. Not to just pull out of thin air an idea that we think the Bible is trying to say to us, or we think God is saying to us through this passage, but to be able to put it in its historical context and recognize that we believe in this historical revelation that God has, that the writers of Scripture, inspired by the Holy Spirit, speak to their context about the way God is present and active in the community of faith, and how he will continue to be present and active in our lives as well. So we don't always just give them the answers. We want to give them the tools to be able to think through, to process, and to explore the text and the moment and the situation and think about how God is present. So this educational model of information processing. 2, conditioning, physical skills and habits. The first model is linked to the domain of knowledge. The second model is linked to the domain of skills and habits. It is in which learning is tied to consequences often. So the idea is if you do this, you will get this reward. If you don't do this, you suffer these consequences. Or if you do this in this particular way, there could be punishment or a consequence. So it's a very somewhat legalistic way of teaching, but it can be effective in certain scenarios. You know, sometimes in Sunday school, when we're a small child, we might have this system of getting stars. If we brought our Bible, if we brought a friend, if we made a call during the week, you remember all those? You get these stars, and those were these little rewards. When I was in elementary school, I remember I had a teacher, my 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Hoffman, and on the chalkboard, she said, at the top of the board, she had in one corner the word doers, D-O-E-R-S, doers, and she had a line under it, and then she started with the names of the kids in class. And if you got your work done, if you did your assignments, if you showed up on time, you know, if you didn't in some way get a demerit for not performing well in class, you continued to rise up on that doer list. If you failed to meet one of these requirements, you were erased and put at the bottom of the list. So it was constantly rotating, you know, and you might get up there and you'd be at the top of the doers list and you'd have all these rewards. You got to be in the front of the line on the way to lunch. You got to be the first out to recess and so on. But as you messed up, you went to the bottom of the list. So this is kind of this legalistic way of teaching. It can be effective with certain age groups, not so effective with others. We wouldn't want to try that in adult class, but and we wouldn't want to do this to just manipulate people. This one is largely built on a legalistic model, and we'd want to be cautious and not irresponsible with how we implement this. Do you have examples of this model of teaching that you've seen? You know, grades are also a consequence of this learning model. Have you seen examples of this kind of learning model?
Mm.
So sometimes you see it even in the workplace. You have bosses who will offer more money if you perform well. You get fired if you don't perform well. We see it not just, of course, in the church. We see it in society, not just in educational models. It's something that's being reinforced all the time. So sometimes even when we're teaching perhaps children or young people, they would ask, why should I become a Christian? Our answer might be, well, so that you go to heaven, so that you don't go to hell. That's a very elementary, you know, kind of response, right? That's not really developing a thoughtful, mindful follower of Christ. That's really just avoiding any sort of negative consequence. So the model is limited in some ways, no doubt, but can be an effective model with developing certain physical skills and habits. So the third model, social model of learning, attitudes and commitment. This is tied to the third domain of attitude and commitment, a model that requires a mentor or an example. We learn attitudes, skills, and commitment from watching another person. We talked about a mentor in the last class. Dallas Willard wrote a book called The Divine Conspiracy, and he talks about discipleship as apprenticeship. You know, we think of an apprentice as someone who is kind of who is shadowing someone who knows how to do a particular task or a trade. And the apprentice then learns by following the lead and doing alongside someone else. Well, Dallas Willard talks about discipleship in this way. Jesus called disciples to walk with him and to implement these certain lifestyle practices, how to pray, how to fast, how to interact and engage people. He taught them these disciplines of lifestyle. So when we teach, we often use a form of all three of these models. We're wanting to create a social environment in which people learn. We're also wanting to engage their skills and habits. We, of course, have content and information, but we want it to be very holistic. Because by itself, for instance, we talked about the limitations of the model. The second model, by itself, it's not going to give a holistic model. Information and content is not going to create a disciple. Skills and habits are not going to create a disciple. Just social mirroring someone isn't going to create a holistic disciple. There needs to be an integration, a kind of negotiation between all of these together. So be aware as a teacher that you are teaching with several different models all at the same time, that you are in and out of these, or you are collectively using these simultaneously. And be intentional with how we do it. So if the teacher is not consistent with a Christ-like model, there will be confusion. That at the heart of all three of these models, we seek to be Christ-like in our content, in our skills, in our social environment. And they will complement one another. Now, we've looked at domains in which we learn, holistic learning, and ways in which we learn, these three models. Now we want to look at how well we learn, the extent or depth of learning in each of these areas. So we're going to think about stages of knowledge. Stages of knowledge. We've discussed domains of learning as knowledge, attitudes and values, skills and habits. Within each of these domains, there is a progression. And this stages of awareness, understanding, and wisdom. So for instance, if I asked you what this was, you would say, this is the giveaway here. I guess I could do that.
A Bible.
You would say, what is it? Yeah, a Bible. You're aware. You know that this is a, you can tell it's a book. You're aware that it's a Bible simply by what it looks like, the knowledge that this is a Bible. But that's awareness. But if you understand, you not only recognize what it is, but you can tell me that this book contains gospels of the life, death, ministry, and resurrection of Jesus. You can tell me that it has psalms, it has poetic literature from David. You can tell me that it has prophets' writings. And then beyond that, so that's understanding, awareness, understanding. Beyond this, however, there's this level of wisdom in which not only do you have an awareness of what it is, you have an understanding of what's in it, but you have a wisdom to integrate this into the application of life. That now I know something about the way reading these Psalms, understanding the parables of Jesus, now guide me into my lifestyle of practicing the faith. We might talk about it as God's guide for living. We might have the wisdom to talk about this as God's self-disclosure to humanity, to creation. These are the kind of answers that demonstrate that I don't just have awareness, I don't just have understanding, I have wisdom. It's this holistic ability to think, process, and then not reproduce, but share, you know. So what we want to do when we teach is push our students to higher stages of learning, not to stay in the awareness stage, not to even get stuck in the understanding stage, but to integrate awareness, understanding with wisdom. So we're going to look at an even more extended version of thinking about stages of learning. So if you look at resource 6.3, expanded version of learning stages. This takes to another level thinking about awareness, understanding, and wisdom. So as we follow the chart through these 6 stages, we have a definition, we have a knowledge domain, an attitude domain, and then these physical skills, habits domain. And if you look at the first stage, we see it's awareness, simply being able to recognize. We use the illustration of this is a Bible. The attitude domain is someone being able to process, not just it's a Bible, but I understand that you have a Christian commitment by your devotion to the Bible. Physical skills, habits of domain, awareness, you're teaching from this Bible. The first stage is awareness. The second stage, stage 2, is comprehension or understanding. It's being able to say in your own words, to make meaning out of what you recognize. Being able to put in your own words. Stage 3 is application. It is being able to take your sense of understanding and apply it in a particular situation. Stage 4 is analysis. It is a bit more sophisticated than application because you don't really need to analyze something in order to use it. You just need to know how it works. But when you analyze something, you can tell the parts of it. You can take it apart and put it back together. You understand it. You can understand what goes into it and how it's made. You have the ability to analyze. So if we look at analysis, the definition being the ability to dissect learning into its parts and put it back together again. Under the knowledge domain, this means perhaps you can find these unifying themes in the Old and New Testament. And right now I'm looking at 6.3, this resource 6.3 on page 41. The attitude domain is being able to embrace these themes of the Old and New Testaments with our heart, thinking about what this theme perhaps require of me. And then the physical skills, habits domain. I will do part of the preparation and lesson under your direction. That the confession here is I invest myself in the preparation and lesson under your direction. These are the things that the student is confessing about the teaching moment and the ability to process in deeper ways as they move and develop educationally. So synthesis or creativity, stage 5, this is a stage that we can take ideas from two places and put them together to make a new idea. It is what happens when we can take several rules from different places and put them together to derive a kind of principle, or perhaps when we can take scripture verses from different parts of the Bible and put the ideas together to find a principle to apply to our lives as Christians. It is the ability to synthesize, to take two very disparate, perhaps, things and be able to integrate for a new path and still move down that path with principle. Synthesis or creativity. It's another level of educational development. And then evaluation. This is the moment in which we are able to give value to our idea, where we are going to be able to make judgments about it, where we begin to make a strong sense of commitment based on all our understanding, analysis, and synthesis. So when we look at these 6 stages in the knowledge domain, we can see that in most of our education, or often in education, we become concerned only about awareness and comprehension. We want them to be able to identify. We want them to be familiar with. We expect them to memorize. But for the most part, these areas don't do it for us. They don't engage us. We might pass a test on it, but in Christian education, we want our students to think at higher levels. We want our students to be able to value ideas. We want them to be able to live with complexities of life and to implement biblical principles for how they conduct themselves in new. This requires us to ask them to think with analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. Any questions about that resource 6.3, expanded learning stages? Well, this is what I want you to do. Keep that that resource 6.3, page 41. And if you'll go further into your packet to page resource 22, are you able to pull that out and look at these side by side? Everybody have that? So I mentioned last week that I would be sure to give you some further instruction that when you go to critique one of the assignments as part of your syllabus is due on March 23rd, and you have 3 contexts for critique, education context. These are the evaluation questions that you'll be answering in response to this lesson critique. And I want to add 2 more questions at the bottom after question A. I want to ask a 9th question, and if you'll write this down as I read it out to you. Question number 9, after number 8, question number 9, using resource 6.3, which is that page 41 that we set aside for a second. Using resource 6.3, what stage of education is this teacher working mostly within? Using resource 6.3, what stage of education is this teacher working mostly within? What stage of education is this teacher working mostly within? So perhaps they're working only within application to that level and not beyond. Maybe they're working to awareness, not beyond. But maybe we see that they're to a place of inviting students to synthesize and creatively implement new directions. We want to be able to identify that with the context. And number 10, the following question, is this an appropriate stage for this group? Is this an appropriate stage for this group? A follow-up question is why? Is this an appropriate stage for this group? Why? And another follow-up question, if not, what would be? If not, what would be? So maybe you are in that setting and you say the teacher is teaching to the level of comprehension, but I really believe that this is a group that can handle application, you know, and each of these lesson critiques, and of course, you know, one of these, let me see, let me get my syllabus and look, which is on, I don't know what pages it is on yours, page 13 maybe. So we're observing others in Christian education settings. 2 of those are, 2 are of other people. 1 is in a different educational context other than your church. And 1 of them is of yourself. So they're 3 altogether. That sounds like 4, but there's just 3. You're critiquing 1 in which you're the teacher. That's 1 of the 3. 2 of the 3 are other people. And 1 of those 2 is someone else, but outside of your context. So you'll have these 2 handy, resource 6.3 and resource 22. If you'll have those handy when you go to do those lesson critiques. Let's do March 23rd. Then that'll help you be able to analyze that situation. Let me get back to where I was. So we have all three kinds of learning, and honestly, all of which are components of spiritual maturity. And that's significant, that there is not just another kind of spirituality aside from awareness, understanding, and wisdom, that spirituality is at the heart of this integration and it's corresponding. Three kinds of teaching that correspond with the three, all being components of spiritual maturity. So if you have resource 6.4 now, and you want to pull that out for a second, components of Christian maturity and domains of holistic learning and ways in which people will learn. It is almost 7, so I'm going to draw this quickly to a close because we have a huge lesson next. Give us time to move into that one. I want to point out the journal questions for lesson 6. They're on page 38. And I always like to continually point to that and to remind you that when you go to journal after this class, whether it's tonight or tomorrow morning, when you go to journal, these journal questions will help you thinking about what we've talked, what you studied. And this will help you that when you go to write your I believe paper, your philosophy of Christian education at the end of the class, which I believe is due March 16th. I believe that's correct. When you go to do that, you'll be drawing from the conversations that you've written down in response to these journal questions. Your journaling will greatly help you. So allow yourself of not trying to catch up down the road on the work you're doing. You'll love yourself for it. You give yourself to that. So we're going to close. We're going to take a few minutes break. Let's take a 7-minute break. And while we're on this break, will you read at some point Luke 15, 1 through 7, so that when we come back together, we can begin thinking and talking about that. So it's 6:30. Let's come back at 7:01. Okay, 7:01, and we'll take this short break. We've got 2 more breaks coming during this evening, so that's why I want to move fast and give ourselves some time. So take a break. We'll come back at 7:01. Well, while we're waiting for them to come back, do one of you all have Luke 15, 1 through 7 already open? We could go ahead and start reading that.
I do.
Yeah,
I have it.
Go ahead. If you'll start reading that.
All the tax collectors and sinners were approaching to listen to him, and the Pharisees and scribes were complaining, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. "What man among you who has 100 sheep and loses one of them does not leave the 99 in the open field and go after the lost one until he finds it? When he has found it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders, and coming home, he calls his friends and neighbors together, saying to them, 'Rejoice with me, because I have found my life.' I tell you, in the same way, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who don't need repentance."
Great. Thank you, Cody. So if you will grab lesson 7.1, it's page 44 in your packet, your student packet. All of these 6 levels of education or learning are listed, and we have we're invited to think about the ways different questions for this text demonstrate the level of education that's going on here. So just at the very preliminary level, who is Jesus teaching? Is simply about awareness. Who is Jesus teaching here?
The scribes and the Pharisees.
Yes, right. And I guess he's teaching tax collectors and sinners also who are with him, but he's really targeting his message toward the scribes and Pharisees, isn't he? So in the stories that he tells, what story does he tell? That's an obvious question, I know, but we're talking about awareness. Go ahead and blurt it out.
The story of the lost sheep.
Yeah, the one lost sheep that's worthy of being leaving the 99 to go find, right? So if we're looking at awareness, we're just simply looking at that. If we're looking at comprehension, we're contemplating why Jesus would tell this story. Why would he tell this story? Why would he tell this story?
Well, the Pharisees were grumbling that he was eating with sinners. And so he tells them this story to address their grumbling.
Yeah, he's identifying for them in this story their position. He is challenging their values that the 99 are more worthy of than the one, right? I mean, he is confronting their assumptions about the faith, about religion, about God's love, about God's concern for others. So so at the comprehension level, we're asking a little bit more complex question. At the application of learning level, we're asking more complex questions. This means with hearers. I want to throw another. We're asking, what does it mean for his hearers? Who are the hearers? Scribes and Pharisees, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, the hearers are also Luke's audience. Can you guys not hear me? So the hearers are also, looks like, let's see.
It's body.
Yeah, you're going in and out.
Okay. I'm not sure what to do about that. So I'll just keep going. The hearers in this context are the scribes and Pharisees, but the hearers are also Luke's audience. who Luke has written his gospel to communicate with, to communicate to. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's another level. How about analysis or problem solving? Another level, and the deeper, more complicated. How did Jesus construct his story? He puts it into the context of asking them if they had sheep, how would they respond if one was lost? He puts them at the center of the story, right? So that's a level of analysis or problem solving. But what if I, in addition to this, said, how does Luke construct his story? How does Luke construct his story? Because that's another level of analysis that we want to be mindful of. Because honestly, each of the gospel writers, and we know this because we've taken biblical studies classes, each of the gospel writers construct their story in unique ways to communicate a truth to their audience. That's why they don't all talk about the same miracles in the same way, or they don't all talk about the same acts and behavior of Jesus in exactly the same way. It fit into a different interpretive framework through which to tell the gospel to their audience. It doesn't make it less accurate. It makes it so that the truth they are seeking to communicate makes sense within the narrative of the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But we are able to analyze with more complexity the text which we are studying. So synthesis or creativity, we begin to think about how we might retell the story, how we might place the story within our context, in which we're talking about Pharisees and scribes, but we're talking to a bunch of Nazarenes. And we're talking to people that perhaps might have their own values, might have their own systems of understanding what God really cares about and what God doesn't really care about, in ways in which Jesus challenges us and opens us to think about others in a way that pleases God. And then evaluation, the final level of education. And it speaks to how then we respond. How does our new understanding of the passage affect our attitude toward the lost? It gives opportunity for us to respond and to act. What is our decision about our responsibility, and how will this principle be? How important will it be in our daily life? So that's just kind of a brief illustration to use a scripture passage and to walk through the these questions and their levels, kind of, I almost wanted to say layers, their levels of educational complexity. And we won't see all of these asked in every educational context. Some of these would be beyond the age group we might be teaching. And we want to be able to identify what's appropriate for which age. And that's what we're going to begin looking at as we move forward. So if we could look at, 7.2, the very next page, and you've got these 9 pictures. On the left, you have an infant and what looks to be perhaps like a kindergarten, and then a toddler at the bottom. And then on the right-hand side, you have, it took me a while to figure out what that picture was, but I guess that's a baby spoon for like feeding Gerber, soft food. And then you have flatware, and then you have a bottle. And match these up with what I ask you to do, because that's almost insulting to our level of education. You match and pair these up with the appropriate age level for its use. And basically what this is just inviting us simply to do is to recognize that there is readiness for learning. There is readiness for learning and for engagement that matches where people are in their developmental stage. So we want to think about how to know when someone is ready to learn. How do we know when they have learned? And these are what will be on our mind as we move through this. So let's look at the learner objectives on page 43. And if we could read those together as we begin this lesson. At the end of this lesson, participants will, John, if you'll start us.
Define readiness for learning.
Great. Diane, can you read the next one?
Explain if there is no learning, is there teaching?
Which is a fascinating question to me and a good one. David, can you read the next one?
Define developmentism.
Yeah, developmentalism.
There you go.
And the last one, Cody.
Discuss 3 characteristics of developmental approach and 4 developmental assumptions.
Right. If you pull resource 7.3, which is page 46 out and have that ready, and maybe perhaps take some notes and jot down some ideas as we move through these ideas of what we're thinking about when we talk about a readiness for learning. The question, how can we tell when we are prepared to learn, when people are prepared to learn? And this has to do with 2 things. It has to do with the ability to learn and the motivation or willingness to learn. The ability to learn involves a level of maturity and prior learning. Obviously, we cannot teach everything to children because they're not ready to learn it. We have to determine their level of ability, what they're ready for. We must teach at their level, or maybe leading them just a little bit, maybe teaching just ahead of their level to them to come along. But we want to offer age-appropriate education. Sometimes, have you ever tried to teach someone who is not quite ready? That can be a very frustrating experience, and perhaps it's more our fault than theirs, that we have aimed at a different level of education for their ability. Motivation or willingness to learn. It's difficult to teach someone who doesn't want to learn or who doesn't want to be taught. They can easily just quit, and it's hard to invigorate them. But if the motivation is that, there's not much you can do if the motivation is not there. On the other hand, we can invite people along, and if they have a willingness and a motivation, that spurs them on even more so. It is such a crucial element to the ability to learn, is having the motivation to press forward, because our motivation will move us to further ability levels. Motivation compels us to further abilities to learn. So think about people in your church or in your social group or at your Sunday school, and I want you to think about people in particular. Maybe you're thinking of 1 or 2 people in particular. What is their ability and what is their level of willingness? Think of a couple people and just go ahead and identify their names in your mind and say, what is, if her name is Sue, what is her ability and what is her level of willingness? And just kind of give an evaluation. You don't have to share a name or anything with us. Now go to the next person and consider their ability to learn and consider their willingness to learn. Go ahead and identify the person and make a kind of an informed judgment on where they are in ability versus willingness. And I have, if you've written the person's name down and kind of jotted down a few notes, I have a few questions to think about. How many of you chose someone who has the ability to learn but is not willing? Did anybody identify someone like Diane? Yeah, the ability to learn but doesn't have the motivation to learn. How many of you chose someone who is deeply willing to learn but perhaps doesn't yet have the ability to learn at a particular capacity? Anybody identify someone like that? David, you can think of someone like that? How many of you chose someone who is both willing and who is both able? No? John says no to both of those. That's the easy kind. If someone has the ability and the willingness, I know a guy who says, you know, God's given me the gift to do just about anything I want to, skill-wise, like fixing things and stuff. He said, he's given me the skill to fix about just anything I want to. He just hadn't given me the want to. So he had the ability, but not the motivation. The easy kind of student is the one who has the ability and the willingness. The most difficult kind is the one who has the ability, but doesn't have the willingness. They're able, but they don't want to. That's the biggest challenge as a student. We can't give up on them, but we do have to face that is a tremendous obstacle. Remember that in a classroom, we have people who are at all different kind of stages, who are at different place in their learning capacity and motivation. And I would just remind us that though motivation can seem to be a really frustrating factor, our curriculum, our lesson reminds us, you know what is one of the major factors behind willingness? It's relational attractiveness and enthusiasm of the teacher. Meaning, has the teacher developed a relationship that is appealing to the student? And is the teacher enthusiastic about what they're teaching? Those are very fundamental factors for the motivation and willingness of a student. And that's pretty powerful for us to face, because it's easier for us to just say, well, they're able, but they're not willing. I can't do much about their motivation, and kind of drop it, you know, and put the ball in their court. But as teachers, as educators, we don't simply want to let it die there, but to build relationship, to be sure to express and exude our enthusiasm and our deep commitment and passion for the subject. So, what is learning? We've been thinking about this. If we teach, does it mean that learning has taken place? There's a good question for us. If we teach, does it mean someone has learned?
No.
It doesn't, does it?
No.
We could teach till we're blue in the face and someone may not have learned. And the question is, have we really taught if they haven't really learned? How do we know when we have learned, or if the students have learned? Anybody want to venture a response to that? How do we know when learning has occurred?
Depending on the story, either when they're able to explain it or actually live it. I don't know.
Absolutely. When we see them begin to implement that, when we see that their life has changed, that they're actually, their behavior or their actions are beginning to model what they have learned, right? Their attitudes are different or stronger. Their actions are different.
I had to go back up. Oh.
So what we want to do then is when we're developing a class, we want to connect and tie the objectives to the change that we hope to see in the students. What do we want to see them live out? What do we want to see them implement? What passions do we want to see them embrace? These become the objectives. Because the object is not teaching, the object is learning. If our goal is only teaching, then we just teach and walk away. We spit it out, we close the book, we're done. But our goal is continually learning. Remember, we're about the formative impact of Christian education. So when I have finished teaching, the process has really only just begun. That's the beginning, is when we have finished that moment, that the education process has really just started, that it's about living into this this model of understanding and application. So the goal is learning, not teaching. So it's important to be careful about how we articulate our objectives. We put them in the terms of the students, not in terms of the teacher. And we are teaching for a change, not just teaching to teach. It is important for us to understand, and now I'm going to move into a portion of the lecture on developmentalism. It is important for us to understand people and how they grow, how they learn to think, how they develop the ability to make decisions and relate to one another. That we are not just biological machines. We are more than this. We are not just plants. You don't just feed us and we grow, but we are very complicated individuals, each of us. We are mind, body, and soul. We have the ability to relate. We're relational beings, and we relate in ways that the rest of creation cannot. We are so much more than biological. So if you want to pull out resource 7.4, which is page 47, we're going to look at the characteristics of a developmental approach. And developmentalism predicts what people will be like at different stages of life. So if I were to say, look at David there. Is David an old man? How do you know he's not an old man?
You got more hair than I do.
Okay, he's got all his hair, and it's all brown. He's wearing a hoodie. That's one sign that he's not an old man. He's wearing a hoodie.
No wrinkles.
No wrinkles. He's smiling. He can't be old. He's smiling. That part's a joke. But we can identify physical attributes and even stylistic attributes that belong to a certain stage of developmentalism. We know he's not an old man because he belongs to this developmental stage, right? So developmentalism views these stages as having an established order and direction. Developmentalism recognizes that we move through stages of growth, and you don't go to one stage of growth and then to another stage and then back to it. You move sequentially through a pattern. There's a established order and direction to developing. You don't become an old man and then become a baby and then a teenager. There's an established order. Number 3, developmentalism affects what people learn and how they learn it. Affects what people learn and how they learn it. And number 4, developmentalism is a respectful and a disciplined way to view people. It is a way of studying people that is respectful. We do not do experiments on people like the Nazis. We do not cut a healthy person apart to find out what he or she looks like. We don't take twins and test one in this way and poke and prod the other in that way to see how they respond. We don't withhold food to see how a person starves. We don't do like the Tuskegee experiments and withhold medication from people of a certain race to see how they respond to an illness. These are ways in which political powers and powers within healthcare administration have botched the idea of respecting people. The political regimes, people with power have done this. This is evil, and that's not what we do when we look at developmental stages. Developmentalism, by contrast, observes what happens to people. It respects their value, but it is also scientific. It is a respectful scientific observation of people, and we can trust it. And as we move through, I think you'll begin to understand a little bit deeper what we mean by this. So the next resource, 7.5, page 48, you can pull that out. We're going to think about these developmental assumptions. In essential attributes, number 1, people are more alike than they are different. They are more alike than they are different. We are very similar to one another. And we have a lot of commonality. And a very fundamental developmental assumption is that people are more alike. At our worst, we tend to exacerbate differences and to point to those as reasons for not understanding one another. And that's not necessary. We are more alike than different. Number 2, the essence of who we are is in our genetic structure. We gain new knowledge, our body grows, we have new experiences, but we are essentially the same person we were when we were born. There's this continuity with our genetic structure. We grow in continuity with who we have been. Number 3, the patterns of human development are in the nature of what it means to be human. So, for the most part, we don't just decide to grow a third arm and then we grow a third arm. That there's a pattern of human development that we pretty much grow within. Number 4, these patterns cannot be significantly altered. Even the way we relate to the world is built into our lives. If every one of us was different and we developed differently, we couldn't say much about how people learn, but we are actually very similar, and we are able to identify that we have this general pattern of development that we share. Number 5, human development in our lives can be seen in several interconnected areas of life: physical, personality, social, moral decision-making. These are developmental patterns that can be seen, or areas of our life that can be seen or heard. But there are also developmental areas that are not necessarily seen. The spiritual growth that takes place, the spiritual development. Number 6, development must be understood holistically. Holistically. We'll be talking a bit about that more in the future. Number 7, environment can help or hinder our development. Now, for example, if we took a baby who was born and we fed him, changed him, but every time he ate or was clean, we just laid him back in the crib. No toys, no human interaction or affection, no talking to. That absolutely creates a context that determines or impacts or influences his development. On the other hand, we have another baby in the crib, and this little baby, she is picked up and held and loved. she is fed, she is cleaned, she is talked to, she is loved on, she is understood. When she cries, she gets a response instead of complete absence. You know, I remember one time Allie was keeping nursery in Texas at our first pastorate. And I remember that she was changing a little baby's diaper, and it was a family we weren't very familiar with, kind of a hard, tough life. And this baby had the worst diaper rash of that Allie couldn't even imagine. She just said it was so awful. And we had babies at the time, and she knew to be real careful cleaning the baby and changing the diaper when it had diaper rash, because ours would really react and cry when you got the wipes out. And this diaper rash was the worst she'd ever seen. And she said the baby didn't even cry when she wiped the baby clean over the sensitive areas. Why? Because the baby had learned at a young age that crying does not elicit a response. And something about the developmental atmosphere of this child had already taught the baby certain things about the inability to be heard, to be cared for, to be loved. That's, to me, a powerful example of the impact that environment can have on our development. So we want to create the kind of context that helps people grow, that helps people develop in ways that are beautiful and good and God glorifying. We want to help people grow the way they should, the way that helps them be healthy beings. Number 8, development is best understood as a matter of losing limitations rather than adding something. If you are a gardener, you know that the pattern for the flower lies in the seed. The gardener makes sure that the conditions are right for the flower to develop. But the gardener does not put things on the flower to make it pretty. The pretty is within the design of the seed itself. The seed has within it the ability of becoming, right? In the same way, God has a desire for us to grow. God put the plan in the seed. God has put the plan in us, and we spend the rest of our lives growing and becoming. So it's best understood development as a matter of losing limitations rather than adding something. Number 9, development can be stopped by adverse conditions. Children born into a home where both parents are alcoholics may not receive the care God desired for them to receive. They, for instance, like this little girl that I was talking about, their understanding of the world and relationships are affected, and they often have trouble relating to other people. And often we see that they go and find a mate, a partner in life who is very similar to the parent. They find someone else who's an alcoholic, or they perhaps find someone and have difficulty relating to someone outside of that cycle. Number 10, fulfilling the continuing pattern of human development throughout life is a requisite for fulfilling humanness. So what I mean by that is when we talk about what it means to be fully human or alive, we are talking about fulfilling the pattern that God has for us in our lives. We're talking about living into what it means to be created in the image of God. And that's good news. It's in our moral decisions that we make based on God's principles. It's how we think when we think with the fullness of God that God gave us to think with, the fullness of mind that God gave us to think with. He invites us to be at peace with who we are, not spending our life trying to be someone else or wish we were someone else. he invites us to live into relationships that are healthy with people who are close to us, to share healthy intimacy with others, in community, and perhaps in relationship with our spouse. And so this event happens in our physical lives, but it also happens in our emotional lives. This living into our healthy self. Our development is at heart about God's pattern for us to grow as to our full human potential. It begins when we are conceived and continues throughout our life. So we can know how people are growing. To sum this up a little bit, we can know how people are going to grow, and we can plan our Christian education in light of our understanding of what is appropriate at various stages of life. We choose the way in which we set the classroom, in which we create an environment for different ages and the kinds of concepts that we present and that we invite them to think about. So remember that all of the ways we develop are integrated together. So when we are addressing an area, we are never addressing it in isolation. There's deep integration in developmentalism. Even though we have been talking about people generally as a large group, we also recognize that each individual is unique and develops at a different rate. So as we minister, we remember that our ministry is to individuals as well as groups. Any thoughts on that? We went through quite a bit just there. Any thoughts on that? So how would you define readiness for learning? Readiness for learning. What do we mean by readiness for learning?
Well, you got to be willing to be on time, prepared. You know, you got to. It's not just about being there, but being there mentally. You know, not just check out.
Okay, but we're also talking about a learning that is consistent with someone's ability, with someone's developmental stage. So I'm not going to teach a systematic theology class to 12-year-olds, or I'm not going to teach, on the other hand, I'm not going to teach necessarily how to memorize the 10 Commandments to a senior adult class, because it's not consistent with the readiness to learn. One of them's not ready to learn that. The other group was ready to learn that 70 years ago, and they need something with more meat. So a readiness for learning is giving a nod, is gesturing toward the fact that people are at different developmental stages and the capacity to learn. How would you explain this? If there is no learning, is there teaching? What would you say?
Not effective teaching anyway.
Right. Yeah, the
Right,
teaching.
we could be teaching over their head, like you said earlier.
Go ahead.
Effective learning. I mean, we could be teaching over their heads and not ever teaching them a thing. It's knowing, like you said, what level they're on and what we can and can't dig into, but also the types of words we have to use. It's not dumbing it down, but it's putting it on a level to where that particular age group can understand it.
Right, right. We want it to be accessible. So define developmentalism. Anybody want to define developmentalism?
Well, the idea that, as humans, we go through these particular stages, one after the other, and we need to match, what we're doing as teachers to that particular stage of development that our students are in. Now, the hard thing for me, especially dealing with adults, is how do you know what level? I mean, with kids, you can kind of base it on their age, but with adults, how do you know what particular level they're in?
That's a good question. And I think as we wrestle with this more and chew on this more, I think we'll give you some tools for being able to identify that. I mean, you won't know just by looking at somebody, but I think we'll have tools for thinking about where people are, And part of that we know by observing their involvement in the church and their engagement with different aspects of the church and the community life. But great question. I mean, that's a real appropriate question.
Yeah. I mean, because I've been shocked sometimes in teaching adults. I'll have a person that's been in the church 50 years and they'll come out with something that's almost unchristian. And you think, how in the world do they have that idea? Do they not know that that's not biblical, And so people can shock you.
Well, as we close, I want to think about, and we're going to take another break. And this one's going to be a little bit longer for you. I don't want to waste your time by taking long breaks, but I believe in the importance of taking breaks. And we've been going over an hour and a half now. So I want to take a 12-minute break this time. But I want to do this. When we come back, I want us to think about a story. Think about a story over the break. When we come back, we're going to talk about that story. A biblical story, and we're going to think about how different age groups receive it differently. We're going to think about how we would teach this story to a different age group. So perhaps we had a group of preschoolers, and maybe we had a group of teenagers, and then maybe we had a group of adults. 3 groups: preschool, teenage, adults. And say we had the Zacchaeus story. How would we teach that to these different groups? So if you'll just kind of think about that a little bit, maybe during the break, reflect on that Zacchaeus story. Look it up if you want to read it. You probably know it pretty well. You probably could sing the song, and just how exactly we might teach that story to these different groups. So let's take a 12-minute break this time. Can we come, before I do that, on page 43, I just want to point out the journal questions. Once again, at the end of this lesson, the lesson close on page 43, which is your first page of your lesson. There are these questions that'll help you journal about what we've talked about. And if you find that when you're journaling on this stuff, you don't know all the answers to it, be mindful that taking notes during I can't see what you're doing, so I'm not speaking to anybody. You may have been doing this already, but taking notes is an important part of being able to reflect on it later. So let's take a break. 7:46. Let's come back promptly at 7:58 and enjoy your break. We'll come back and we're going to hit it hard when we get back. Thanks, guys. That was a good session. Well, now, welcome back. I have two of you back. So let's go ahead and start. We can begin this exercise on Zacchaeus and thinking about the different age groups. I felt like that might be an appropriate one. So thinking about the Zacchaeus story, if we had three different groups, preschool, teenagers, and adults, how might we teach this different? So let's start with preschool. How would we teach Zacchaeus, the story of Zacchaeus, to preschoolers?
Go ahead, John.
Well, I was going to say, I think you would want to make it more active, have them act it out, maybe something like that.
Yeah.
But you put more emphasis on the story part, I guess.
Yeah, and what would you say, you can follow up with John's comment, what are some of the themes that you would, emphasize?
His size, like, using that, you go through that just saying that song, and like he said, maybe not necessarily them acting it out, but if you've got a couple of teenagers that are good with stuff like that could come in and help you, like I always love doing children's church, about once a month when I was a youth pastor, just because I like, but that using the song, realizing his size,
Right.
and his willingness to climb just to see this man. Those are just some first thoughts that come to my mind.
Yeah. Anything else?
Well,
Preschool?
going along with the size, like comparing his size to their size,
Right.
even though he was small like you are, he could still see, find a way to see Jesus and find a way to worship Jesus.
And no matter how small Zacchaeus was, which the point is he was smaller than everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus took notice of him, and
Mm-hmm.
and that's what a great lesson for preschooler, and that must be one of the first songs I learned in church as a kid. Zacchaeus was a wee little man. So yeah, how about with teenagers? What are some of the, they're at a different readiness to learn. They're at a different developmental stage. So how might we be telling the Zacchaeus story for teenagers?
Zacchaeus was like an outcast.
Ah,
He was on the outside of the in crowd, and so, but Jesus still loved him, and
yeah,
Jesus took notice of him.
right, right. What else? I imagine we might focus on the power of his conversion. I mean, he made a dramatic about face, and then he followed up with some decisions about how he was going to live. So you might even draw into your story on ways Zacchaeus sought to make restitution, ways that he sought to make good on the ways he had cheated and stolen from people in the past. So perhaps conversion and making restitution are some themes that you would build into the Zacchaeus story for teenagers. Anything else?
Well, I think I would emphasize, his desperation, that Zacchaeus was willing to be embarrassed, that he's climbing this tree as a little bitty short guy, and that only tends to draw attention. Teenagers are deathly afraid of being embarrassed. And to see someone who's willing to risk that because he's determined he's going to, to see Jesus.
Yeah, or to go against the flow in some way.
Yeah.
That's good. Good point. So how about adults? And both in as it pertains to themes and how we tell the story, but also what we're inviting them to process about the story. How might we tell this story for adults? We're getting more complex, a higher level of analysis and evaluation.
I think you would bring in more context as far as, social, political.
Yes.
One of the things is Jesus is taking a risk in approaching Zacchaeus, to be linked with this guy that's seen as so, hated by so many people because of his job and what he's doing. And
right. Yeah, great point. That Jesus is actually entering this kind of unknown space, the political space for the day and time. By unknown, I mean this risky space in territory for communicating the grace of God to people's lives. Excellent insight, and to be able to process and to talk about and discuss and dialogue that together with all of its, like you said, historical context, gives the adult class the ability to really analyze and evaluate and make application to our contemporary situation. Good job. Anything else on that? I think we've covered that pretty well. So we can see how a story like that really takes shape in different ways for the different groups. And sometimes that seems obvious, but when we, again, come to terms with the objective of learning and take some time to explore this, we can see how one simple story like that can really take on some nuance and have a really formative impact for people. So many educational tasks require skills that are that are built over time, and to leave out an intermediate skill and more advanced development will be hindered. So we want to recognize the building of developmental abilities. Each level builds on the previous, and we want to recognize this continuity. Before we move any further, let's look at page 49 and let's read those learner objectives. There are only two. At the end of this lesson, participants will, David and Cody, will you guys just read those two?
Correlate physical maturation and cognitive development.
Identify 4 stages of, what's that say? I can't see that. Paget's theory of intellectual development.
That's right. So you can see on resource 8.1 in the student guide is page 50. We see different levels of math skills. Now that's just something just to kind of look at. I don't want to spend much time there, but you can just see that's one example. So we're going to think as we continue to move into thinking about physical and intellectual growth and the ways that these correspond and correlate. Let's think about physical growth. Changes take place throughout life that affect the way we teach. We make assumptions about biology when we teach, about how the body grows, how we understand the body growing, and then we make application to the way in which we teach. We may not even realize that we do this, but we do. So you might have a few different age groups, maybe birth to 4 years old, 5 to 11 years old, 12 to 18, and adulthood. These are these 4 age levels that we're going to be looking at a little bit, and how physical growth and intellectual development correlate. So, for instance, if you were to identify characteristics of a certain age, say 5 to 11, the age group 5 to 11, and the age group birth to 4 years old, they are dealing with a number of issues. I'm not setting this up exactly how I want to, but for instance, the 5 to 11, what are some of the physical environments we put in place to aid their classroom experience based on their biological development, where they are in life? What are some of the things that we do to aid the learning environment physically?
You would have size appropriate furniture.
Okay, yeah. Maybe some chairs that are smaller and a table that fits a little better. Go ahead. You were about to say something, Cody.
I would say put the books of the Bible that they're learning.
What? Put them where?
Like on the wall and like
Yeah.
colorful or like different shapes, like to attract their attention.
Right. Some attention, some visual stimulation. Absolutely. What else might we do? I remember Sunday school.
You're going to make it fun, whether it be in song or, little skits and things like that. But you're going to do things that are going to catch their eye, be fun. You talked about one of the first songs you ever learned to sing was that Kiss, and that was me too. And but things like that, you're going to, whether it be through song or little skits or storytelling, but storytelling in a way that makes it come to life to them. Things like that at that age.
Yeah, definitely. Were you going to say something, Diane?
Yes, you can use like games and even snacks to bring them in, get them interactive, and get them, so that it'll stick. Crafts.
Right. Yeah. Putting to use their creative energy. Also recognizing their relational, where they are relationally, how they develop, how they interact with one another, all these things. Well, good. So as we think about these things, we're recognizing that the educational environment, of course, has an impact on the educational experience of each age group. We would choose very different things for adulthood, very different context. The physical environment that we describe would be very different. We won't go into all that now. But one of the things we recognize is, as pastor or some ordained leader within the church, we become the expert on recognizing that there is age-appropriate environments and context for educating across the span of generations that exist within the church, which is a unique educational environment as opposed to elementary school education or college, or even in a senior adult home where you're keeping people active and engaged. I mean, you've got this whole gamut of educational experience and interaction. And we want to be those who are mindful of the span of life. Besides physical growth, we also grow intellectually. We're going to think about how this correlates a little bit. In chapter 6 in the book On the Way, one of the things we did is fill in Piaget's theory of intellectual development. Chapter 6 was a pretty dense chapter. I mean, it was a pretty involved chapter. And we're going to look at it a little bit. But if you have resource 8.3, it's page 52, and you just want to keep that handy. So besides physical growth, we're thinking about intellectual development. A Swiss psychologist named Jean Piaget began to study thinking. He determined that we can not only think more, but in different ways as we develop. Both quantity and quality of thought changes. And he outlined 4 stages. And so with 8.3, we're going to look at these 4 stages. They are the sensory motor stage, the pre-operational thinking stage, concrete operations, and formal operations stages of development. So that first stage is from birth to 2 years. This is the stage at which the sensory motor, birth to 2 years old, which is pretty broad. I mean, these are very broad categories or stages. At this stage, children believe that all the toys in the world are theirs. You know, their favorite word is mine, or everything exists in an extension to me. It's pretty self-centered. They're not necessarily selfish. They're just, that's the way they navigate the world at that point. They have very basic communication skills. Their play is not necessarily orderly or organized, but it's very sensory motor. The second stage, pre-operational thinking, ages 2 to 7 years, where we begin to work with symbols and pictures. Words begin to have meaning. They begin to enjoy picture books and to associate pictures with words, which incidentally, I mean, essentially all words are pictures themselves. When you study language, you begin to identify that letters were characters that represented something concrete in life at one time that was reduced to a sound and to a symbol. Like the letter Bet in the Hebrew alphabet looks like a it almost looks like a little shelter. Bet. And the word bet, the letter bet is also a word bet, which means house. It was a drawing, a picture of a little house for the sound ba or va. So then you get the word Bethlehem, house of bread. You know, you've got these little pictures that become linguistic, become language. And so as children are developing language, developing thought, developing the words, the ability to express themselves in words, symbols and pictures begin to take on meaning. They begin to intersect these. They begin to switch them up and move them around and create sentences on their own. Play begins to take on meaning for them. They can pretend that they are a soldier. They can pretend they're a cook. They can pretend that they are driving a car. They can begin to imitate the actions of adults. They can begin to write words during this period and begin to associate meaning to the words they've written down. Their thought processes are just really developing at this stage. They begin to recognize that all the toys in the world are not theirs, but that toys can belong to other people, you know. They have this awareness of others. Then there's the third stage, concrete operations, ages 8 to 11 years. 8 to 11 years. Children begin to think in patterns and systems. They can organize or classify their thoughts. They begin to do math, but they may not do like a square root. They can do math problems, but not certain math problems. They're taking thought to a higher level. At this age, they want to have the right answers. They all want to raise their hand and wave it wildly, so you'll choose them to answer the question. They want to give a right answer. That's actually a really good age. At Bible school, this is like the best age to get, right, Diane? That's like the best age to get, especially the 8 to 9 years old. The 11 gets a little too close to 12, but 8 and 9, that's like the best age to get. They like to fill in the blanks. Curriculum for Christian education must involve very basic kind of facts, but they also enjoy like memorizing scripture. It just makes them a joy, you know. It's not that hard for us, and they seem willing, and they're kind of showing off their ability to their ability. They have mastered awareness, and now they're understanding in new and neat creative ways. And then there's the fourth stage, the stage of formal operations, 12 years to adulthood. So it begins around 12 years old, continues, and we continue to develop this way through adulthood. We often refer to this as the formal operations stage, where we are able to manipulate our thoughts. We can think about ideas and concepts and not just simply objects. We can think in abstractions. We can come up with new ideas. We can put existing ideas, disparate existing ideas together and come up with new ideas. We can use logic. We can use logic to argue, to discuss, and develop complex arguments. We can begin thinking about abstract ideas in Christian education, like the grace of God or Christian love. We can think through doctrinal systems. With children, doctrine is just like memorizing. It's like a catechism. It's like memorizing the 10 Commandments or a scripture or passage. But doctrinal study with adults begins to be more analytic. We can analyze why we would believe, why we would logically flow from a certain concept of God to a particular doctrinal position. So the formal operations, as we recognize in the expanded learning stages chart, which was on 6.3, page 41, that's the one that I invited you to set aside for the lesson critique. We recognize that formal operations is required before we can do certain things, before we can analyze or synthesize or apply. And we should begin to use these kinds of skills in the classroom and introduce them gradually, not overwhelm students, but introduce them for their readiness and where they are developmentally. So when you get to that chapter, if you haven't gotten to it already in Les Steele, that's a pretty dense chapter, and it'll take some time and working through and careful study. I encourage you to complete it well. Again, your study guide will be something we'll collect at the end. It may take you some time. Take the time to do it and do it well. And it'll help you with moving forward in the entire course. I'm going to wrap up that chapter and jump now into lesson 9. And I think it's been a little too soon for us to take a break. So let's just move right into lesson 9 so that we can get 4 lessons in at the end of today. So resource 9.1, page 55. Our lesson asked the question, have you known grown adults who were still socially clumsy teenagers, or maybe obnoxious children, or even spiritual infants? Have you ever known adults who seem to exude a different kind of developmental level? Yeah. This lesson is a continuation of the concepts of developmentalism we discussed in the last session, the last lesson, what we just did. We will extend our discussion of human development to psychosocial, moral, and spiritual development. And so in this resource 9.1, I guess this is just a picture of ways in which someone might develop spiritually, not develop spiritually. They could be still a spiritual infant, even though they're an adult body. Socially, they might be like a awkward teenager who doesn't quite know how to interact, or an obnoxious or spoiled child that wants it his way. So let's read together our learner objectives, page 54. At the end of this lesson, participants will, John, will you read that first one?
Identify the 8 stages of psychosocial development.
Okay, and the next one, Diane?
Compare and contrast the stages of psychosocial development with the stages of moral development.
Okay. And David, can you do the last one?
Name and describe 4 stages of vocational growth.
Great. So in the last session that we went over really fast, we talked about physical growth and intellectual growth in the ways that they correlate, right? By talking about the classroom setting, physical growth and intellectual growth correlate. Today, or tonight, the rest of the night, we're going to talk about psychosocial growth and ways in which personality is composed of, within psychosocial growth, 2 parts, temperament and identity. Temperament and identity. Psychosocial growth, our personality is composed of 2 parts, temperament and identity. Number 1, temperament influences how we act or how we feel. We might describe a person as shy. Their temperament is that they're shy, or maybe this one's outgoing or introverted or extroverted. We're talking about their temperament. And then number 2, identity. Identity answers the question deep within us, who am I really? When we feel good about our identity, we have this sense of emotional health. When we feel bad about our identity, we have low self-esteem, we have self-doubt, we have questions about ourselves. So our personality is composed of 2 parts, temperament and identity. Resource 9.2, page 56. We have 8 stages of psychosocial development. These are attributed to Erik Erikson, who studied personality development over the lifespan. He combined the ideas of self and our interaction with the world to study personality. And he established this theory of these 8 stages of life in which each certain personality characteristics are developed. Each stage builds on the last stage, similar to ways in which we look at developmental patterns. As we move through life, we shape our identity according to those challenges we face at each level. And so there are certain somewhat life crises through which we develop capacities, or what he refers to as virtues. So number 1, infancy. And if you have that 56, you can kind of identify here. Incidentally, this is also, for reference, page 128 in your study guide. When you do the work on the Steel book, you don't want to just fill this out based on this resource 9.2, but this study guide page 128, is inviting you to fill this information in as well. If you try to do it based on resource 9.2, it won't be accurate entirely. So do it from the book, not from this, but it's all from the same source is what I'm saying. And in my book, it was page 79, but you'll identify it when you get to it. So number 1, infancy. We are learning to build trust. In infancy, the challenge is to develop trust. When a baby is first born, she must rely upon others for everything. And depending on how those needs are met, which we talked about earlier with this example of this little baby girl, the baby either develops a sense of trust or a sense of not being able to trust others. So that's why it's important to show love, of course, to children at an early age. Number 2, toddler. Learning to gain a sense of autonomy. Begins at about age 2. Here the challenge is to develop a sense of self, the desire to say, I want to do that. It is the development of the sense of will. We talk about the terrible twos when they're developing their strong will. If they develop that will, they can move on to stage 3. We don't want to break the will. We want the will to develop, and to recognize that it's an important part of the autonomy building sense of self. Number 3, preschool, initiative. This stage occurs right before one begins school. The challenge at this stage is to develop initiative or a sense of purpose. The children begin to plan things. They might even plan how they play. You can begin to see this in children right before school age. As we said, they want to choose their own clothes. They might want to feed themselves. They might want to do something their way. They're taking initiative, developing a sense of purpose and initiative. Number 4, school age, competence, developing competency. This is the age of the right answer. It is the age of being able to say, I did it, I filled in all the blanks, I memorized all the verses. They're checking off the ability to perform, to achieve. It is the development of confidence in addition to competence. I can and I will. It's a deep confidence builder in self. And as Erickson identifies, it is important to develop this confidence because it is so necessary, as are all of these, for the challenge of the next stage. Big challenge, number 5, which is adolescence, the developing of identity. When we begin answering the question, asking and answering the question, who am I? I am not only my parents' child, I am something uniquely other than that as well. And so who am I? So Eric spent much time studying adolescence because it was such a critical time for the forming identity. It's a critical time for religious decisions because the answer of the identity question has to be dealt with. Adolescence can be asking and answering the question, what do I believe? That's why at teen camps, we invite teens to make decisions. Even if they're raised in a Christian home, they might want to make a decision at that point. They're making decisions for themselves, not because they've been required to. They have a really new ability to make a commitment to something. And Erickson talks about committing to be faithful to something or someone and how significant this is at this stage. So this is a great opportunity at this age, as we know, to evangelize, to share the good news, to share the gospel. It really begins to integrate with someone's life and their lifestyle decisions and the way they choose to, what they choose to value and the way they choose to live. Number 6, young adult, in which people are developing the capacity for intimacy, to develop significant relationships with other people. This person who now has now has a clear understanding of their identity, wants to invest in relationships with others. It could be intimacy within community, small groups where they find deep emotional fulfillment. It could also be through the partnership of marriage or companionship of someone romantically, but you're developing relationships with others. Friendships are different than when teenagers. You have more life experiences to communicate and connect with others. We also develop the opportunity to be intimate, not just physically, but spiritually. Think about the church and our ability to be open and honest with one another. Think about small groups and the level of sharing that goes on, particularly at this stage, the young adult stage. A strong sense of self and the ability to trust, and now the ability to share in unique ways, share struggles, share trials, but also to have this capacity for empathy to care what other people are going through. And so in the young adult stage, where these relationships become so important and can last a lifetime, we want to be careful to create conditions to allow for that kind of intimate small group opportunity. Can you think of things that might, in society, that might help or hinder these kind of close relationships that as a church we might want to be aware of? And I'm not done going through all those. I'm just stopping at the young adult stage for a little bit. Can you think of ways that perhaps society or culture might help or hinder close relationships and how the church might be aware of that?
Well, I think, one of the things we're dealing with today is this whole idea of social media and, Facebook, and really kind of a false sense of intimacy that it produces. We're still not sure exactly how that's affecting us, but that's going to have a huge impact, I think. That's
a really good point. And your phrase, false sense of intimacy, that's a really good point. People feeling like they know someone else, I guess perhaps because they know where they stand on a position, or because they have connected with one another in very private settings. So you might connect with someone online from your bedroom and it's just you and that person. Or you might connect in other ways. You might share your thoughts that you wouldn't share necessarily face to face, but there's this strange comfort in being able to share it, and yet it's exposed as if you were standing outside with a microphone. It just really strange false sense of intimacy, and also this really inability to enter dialogue, and which to me speaks to some of the breakdown of empathy, in which people stand and posture up and point fingers in social media, which is something I observed that it just kind of has kind of averted me from social media in many ways. I'm not really into it these days. I've had Facebook, I've had Twitter, and I'm on a break from all that right now, for a while, for a few years actually. And not that anybody needs to, I don't have a problem with it. It's not always the best form of communication. It's frustrating. So I can see how it can help and hinder. You get to stay in connection and in touch with people that you may not get to stay in touch with. You get to see pictures and watch your friends' children grow up or something. But then, like you said, John, there are also these big hindrances to healthy relationship. Well, as the church begins to grow, as we begin to seek to create context for healthy relationship, we want to be mindful and maybe even address some of those things, we want to create space where people can belong, where if they have a family, their family can belong, and that they can be intimate and trust others. Providing these opportunities in the church for these kinds of relationships is very important, and to make that a priority is a very significant part of what we're doing for creating an environment for formative Christian education. It speaks to the significance of having smaller groups for connecting at a different level, so that as your church grows and more distance can be created between people, continually reducing to small groups for the opportunity for connection. Number 7, middle adulthood, where we are deciding how we want to invest in the future. The challenge here is to choose between two options. Shall I give myself to invest in the future, which means I will give my energies to develop the next generation who is coming after me? Or will I protect everything that I have done and focus on conserving everything and not allowing change? Kind of this preserving, I don't want to use an overused cliche, the status quo, but in a sense, it is that preservation mindset. So you see generativity versus stagnation is how the Erickson conflict is described. There sometimes are individuals and churches that want their church to continue as it has always been. They want to protect the past rather than invest in the future. This is the stage of life in which the middle adult must make a decision to invest in the future or protect the past. And sometimes when people are interested in protecting the past, they're opposed to changing anything. They may not trust anyone who brings new ideas. They may not trust someone who is younger than they are. They feel like they may not have the maturity that those who have been there longer have, and don't have the wisdom, and they want their decisions to protect their own investment. So investing in the future requires a different kind of disposition. And this crisis, this conflict can lead us to think about future generations in which we want to be generative, investing in others. Turn the leadership of the church or organization over to the care of those coming up along behind us, so that we begin to develop into more of a mentor, perhaps, even than a leader. I've heard it said, we're looking to replace ourselves. We become a mentor so that someone can step into a position of leadership. Number 8, older adulthood, integrity versus despair, Erickson says. The issue is integrity or wholeness. The goal is to be able to look back and say, yes, I have lived life well. What I have given myself to has been good. I can come to the end of my life with peace. It doesn't mean we come to the end of life with no regrets, just a sense of integrity, meaning that there's an integral wholeness to our life. We look back and we see ways in which our life has continuity and meaning. The community of faith helps people understand how much they have contributed and how much they are valued. We often give older people the idea in society that they don't have anything to offer, but we need them. We need them for their wisdom, for their prayers, for their example. We need them for their stories, for the ways that they can narrate meaning for life. And perhaps, some have been celebrated, some have really invested themselves, and they're in this final stage of life, and they have much to share and express, and they've got great testimonies and stories. There are others who may get to this final stage of life, and they might have a load of regrets. They might feel like they've wasted years, wasted time. They might feel like they have thrown away relationships that they wish they could have done something better with. We have the privilege of speaking to both those who feel good about their years and those who may not feel good about their years. And so in this stage of life, we can offer them the grace of God. We can offer, and perhaps should never neglect the opportunity to recognize people in a later stage of life are also at a readiness point for conversion decisions, that they can receive forgiveness, that they can be at a place of restoration of the heart, mind, and body, that God can take what they thought they had wasted and use it for good. One of my good friends who died about 2 years ago was an alcoholic for years, and often his career was messed up by it, and he was in and out of rehabs, and he had a failed marriage, and he had a lot of reasons to really regret things about his life. But something happened. He got involved in a faith-based rehabilitation program, and he decided to simply invest himself in others getting well also. He moved on to a property where his son lived, and they had this little garage that my friend was a woodworker. He had a woodworking shop, and he had a little apartment. And then he just enjoyed life on this several acre little lot next to his son. And you would have thought he had prepared all his life for this moment. He was one of the happiest people I've ever watched die. We would sit outside, drink coffee, and he would look at the leaves on the trees. He would watch the bumblebees and the hummingbirds, and he would just talk about how good God was and how God was always showing himself to us through creation. He was always talking about how God wanted to redeem us from our brokenness and help us through that. He would go to AA meetings almost every night. He was a mentor to dozens and dozens of people trying to overcome addiction. And he was just a really wonderful man. And he and his wife, who had divorced earlier, had restored their relation. They never remarried. They never became what you call husband and wife again. But he, in his later years, called her his best friend. And they would have weekly meals together. And it's just like you would have thought he had prepared all his life to enjoy this last stage. And yet he was dying of cancer. But he was engrossed in the incarnation of Christ that he experienced at every turn in his existence. And he was constantly in testimony of how good God was to him. To me, that's a powerful witness to the way in which this final stage need not be remorse. It doesn't have to be regret. It doesn't have to be clinging to what was so wonderful either. But it can be a testimony that the grace of God is abundant and the presence of Christ is among us and with us and is redeeming and renewing all things. And his life is a beautiful testimony to me. It was a great loss when he died, but I continue to tell his story. And you know what's neat? Around town, I see his son, who I didn't really get to know until I spoke at the memorial service for my friend. And I got to know his son, and now I see him around town, and it's so crazy. I see him at the most bizarre times. I ran into him at the Grove in the university on Father's Day, and we just bumped into each other, and it was the first Father's Day after his dad had died, and we just talked about his dad, John, and what a beautiful soul he was, and how in many ways he's with us, and we continue to share the communion of saints, you know. And I see him at other times, and we just continue to tell his story. And so, again, the life stage, each of the life stages are full of the grace of God. And this is what we bear witness to as the church. And as teachers and educators have the opportunity to emphasize. We've got about 10 minutes. Let me see what I can do here. I promised another break, but I think you'd rather get out when we need to get out. So applying the stages of personality growth. We want to make sure that we make application to these stages. So number one, what do? We treat babies with care and love. If they associate love with the church, they will associate it with God as well. We are being mindful to apply the stages of personality growth to how we treat and interact and provide formative Christian space. Number two, school-age children are developing competence. So in the church, we engage them in musical abilities, you know, skits and plays, and we invite them to memorize scripture. No, that's not the whole of living life in God, is not just memorizing things, but we do believe that the power of memorizing something in childhood is that we are creating the mental furniture for their heart and mind as they develop and grow older. It stays and sticks with them. So we engage them in the service in unique ways, maybe reciting the 10 Commandments for us. We've all seen that, or even listing the books of the Bible. Number three, for early adults, we provide opportunity for fellowship and significant relationships. We're providing those opportunities for them to meet and gather in a home around some food or something. We want to make sure we provide the right context for the right developmental stage. Resource 9.3 on page 57, we're thinking about social development and ways in which we move through this and through the stages of life to develop socially in the same way that we develop competency, in the same way that we develop psychologically, we develop socially. I'm going to move through some of my stuff here because some of this is pretty self-explanatory. Resource 9.4 is on page 58. What is the center? Where is our center of authority for developing moral decision-making? It's important in spiritual maturity to be able to develop our moral values. When we first start making decisions in life, the center of authority is within us, but then we begin to develop and we make decisions based on how it will affect life. We begin to look perhaps initially at rewards or punishments, but then we begin to develop beyond that, right? We're making moral decisions beyond ourselves as we grow older, as we develop. We're making decisions beyond our parents. We're making decisions about the principles of what it means to be a good person. And so the center of authority is beyond ourselves as we develop. We might want to make the right choice so that God will be pleased rather than we're avoiding a punishment, of course. So as we continue to develop, we see that there is a basic kind of moral authority in life. And that we grow beyond simply being legalists. We're not just looking to keep a law, but we see a moral authority that lies in God. But there's still another level of development in terms of moral decision making. When we internalize the principles of morals in our own life, we make decisions based on principle inside of ourselves, not the center of authority that's within us, but the principle that lives within us. I will do the right thing even if everyone else does the wrong thing. I will do the right thing even if I have to suffer for it, because I believe in these principles. I will do the right thing because I believe it is doing the right thing. So that begins to, as we develop a moral capacity, begins to impact how then we behave and act. As we grow, our center of authority moves from inside and selfish to outside of us, and then back inside of us. We internalize it, but it's a different quality. So again, development must be understood holistically. Spirituality must be at the center of our total development. We're not talking about something separate from this development, but something that permeates all development, our spirituality. All of the domains of life are drawn together by spiritual development. You who are leaders in congregations, and each of you are already working and engaged in some capacity, begin to think about what it means for a person to be spiritually mature at their competency, at their developmental stage. Think of the journey that they are on and the various components of their life. So we begin to ask the question, what does it mean for a 12-year-old to be mature? What does it mean for a 65-year-old to be mature? What does it mean for a 16-year-old to be mature? And then there is a vocational growth. Resource 9.5, page 59. What do I got, 5 minutes? Vocational growth, that we are called to serve God. Ephesians 2:10 states, "For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." We have this calling, we have this vocational sense. And in the church, we want to keep in mind two criteria. We've talked about these two things earlier: ability and willingness. And so as you look at vocational growth, you see level 1 is the level of a person who's unable and unwilling. You can't do much with someone who's unable and unwilling. Level 2, unable but willing. That can be frustrating, but at least there's willingness, right? Level 3, able but unwilling. That's the most challenging. We already identified that. Level 4 is able and willing. People are ready and equipped to serve. They probably require less supervision and a greater amount of encouragement, but they are able and willing. They may need some instruction, but they can carry out the task. Vocational growth. Identifying where people are in this may relieve us of a whole lot of frustration. Just recognizing where people are as they move along, and perhaps even identifying for people where they don't know and have not articulated about themselves. This is where they are, right? Maybe even explaining this to people helps reveal to them, well, I don't want to be able but unwilling. I would rather just be able and willing. Maybe clarifying this for people helps them to move on to the next stage of vocational growth. and in spiritual growth. Page 60, resource 9.6, spiritual growth. As we look at all these different developmental capacities, we're not looking again at another component. Spiritual growth, as it says, is the whole pie. No separate area of spirituality exists. And what we seek to have is balance within these, or growth, maturity in these, not balance, maturity in the wheel, in the pie. We are complex human beings. We are complex creatures that we cannot be divided in these unrelated parts from one another. So spirituality is how we keep these in a balanced, interactive, developmental process. Spirituality is evidenced in our body, in our thinking, our identity, our relationships, our morality, and our purpose in life. And so we understand that, we confess that as part of what it means to be called to be holy and to be whole persons. So there are questions at the bottom of page 60. How can you tell you have grown spiritually? Can you offer any outward evidences of growth? Or number 2, do you think there are some common factors that Christian leaders should look for in others to evaluate whether spiritual growth has taken place? Sometimes these questions can be answered simply through the developmental phases that someone is working toward and how they implement those in their life within the community of faith. Well, I've come down to 1 minute. We're going to wrap it up there and then move on next week, starting with chapter 10. I'm not sure how many lessons we'll get through next week. Do you have any questions before we shut it down? I went through a lot. I'm sorry that was fast, but I needed to get it. We needed to get there. Any questions? Well, I encourage you to stay on your reading. Don't get too far behind in that. Be working on your study guide. Be planning and scheduling your lesson critiques. You have those 2 pages that I mentioned that you'll want to have handy for thinking about assessing those educational contexts. Thank you for your interaction. It's good to be together and to talk. Sorry, there was a lot of talking on my part, but that's the way we kind of had to do it. Y'all have a great night, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.